So the next thing we're gonna hit is the pathway to that income, right? So we're gonna dial it in even more. We're gonna dial it in even more about how you actually do this. Because now you got a list of stuff. You're like, great, I got all these things and I can see some value and I got some strategies, some concepts that maybe I can license this, maybe I can leverage it, whatever. But what you need to understand before we take really another step further, you got to understand intellectual property, all right? You got to understand what intellectual property is. And I invited Scott from my team here. Come on up, Scott. Scott McPherson's one of our new attorneys, right? Because I'm growing my business just like you guys are. Yeah, come on over here, Scott. All right, and so he is the reigning expert on intellectual property. If you haven't met him, make sure you meet him. He has a wealth of knowledge as it relates to this. He has been in law for a long, long time. Sorry to date you, Scott.
No worries.
Right? Former general counsel for multi-million-dollar publicly traded companies. Anything that you have going on, he's seen it times 10, right? And he's also a licensed patent attorney, right? He was a former toxicologist. I got your biography memorized. So, guys, Scott's going to help us explain to us about intellectual property, right? Because, again, it's a common mistake to only think of assets as physical assets. Oh, if it's not real estate, it's not an asset. If it's not my house, it's not an asset. If it's not a vehicle, it's not an asset. Guys, at least half of your assets, and probably more, are intellectual, right?
Absolutely.
So you have to have, we're going to go through a crash course, guys, very, very brief. And I'm going to give you a QR code at the very end. We taught a whole webinar on this. We're going to drill down just the basics of what you need to know to understand the licensing and the leveraging, and that you maybe you haven't heard of licensing before. So we're going to go through this. So when I say royalty, you're like, oh, I kind of understand what that means. You know, I understand that. I understand what a trademark is at a basic level, right? It's extremely important. We can't monetize this if you're not protecting it, right? So that's where these strategies come into play. So, Scott, what is intellectual property? What the heck is this?
Well, intellectual property is really kind of everything else. You have your tangible goods in your business. You have, the trucks, whatever, all your tangible assets, the inventory, everything. And then you have what you know, what you do, how you do it, all the secret sauce as to how your company has a competitive advantage over someone else. So from the branding standpoint, that's your trademark. It's like trademark's sole purpose is to avoid consumer confusion. So people know that when they're getting you and not some imposter. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we have the patents are for original inventions, new, useful, non-obvious way of doing something or designing something. And then we have copyrights, which are, basically an original expression fixed in a tangible medium. That's all the other stuff that you create, your websites, your photographs on your websites, everything through it. It's all these other kind of intangibles. And then the one that no one ever remembers is the real secret sauce is your trade secret stuff, the stuff that you would least want your competitors to know about. And usually at the greatest risk for most companies because they don't do a good enough job of protecting it. Because, hey, if your client list comes out and your distribution list gets out and people know how much you pay for X, Y, and Z and what's your blend that you do for what you're doing, you don't want people to have that. So that's part of that fourth kind of unwanted because it can't be registered with the government. It's something you have to do internally to preserve. Mm-hmm. So, but it's all those other things that make you special. It's the spices in your dish, basically. So that makes your dish better than everyone else's.
Yeah, absolutely. And guys, like Scott said, every business has physical assets and intangible assets. Some companies' biggest value is their intellectual property, right? I mean, Absolutely. Can you explain that a little bit about how that works?
Well, yeah. I mean, once you are creating certain assets and you have certain amount of systems in place, then it's not uncommon for people to want to buy that system, whether it's a software component or whether it's basically a proprietary blend. Say you make the best cookies around, right? And you basically sell that way of doing to someone else that they can now make these cookies, and so you don't have to be the only cookie maker. So there's a lot of those other things that now you're licensing rights for people to use. There's two things. Licensing is giving someone basically a rental agreement to use your stuff, and an assignment is when you sell it off completely, almost like selling the house. You get assignment is a deed to that property, basically, of the intellectual property. So there's different kind of deals at different times. Sometimes you have something you're not going to use anymore. It has value. You'll assign it to somebody for, a kind of a nice fee and sell that asset off because you're going a different direction.
Yeah. There are immensely profitable strategies involving intellectual property. All right. So we're going to teach you guys how to monetize this, how to make income from it. You've been learning about intellectual property this whole time. You just haven't known it. Right now you're like, oh, that's what that's called. That's my intellectual property. Right. But before we make money off of it, we have to protect it. So we already talked about some of the examples of intellectual property, logos, taglines, all these kind of recipes, that kind of stuff, right? I mean, like, think of Nike. Sure, you can piece this apart, but the different things that they utilize that are incredibly valuable to them. Can you kind of give some examples?
Well, like the Nike, the iteration of their trademarks, Nike when you see it, right? When they first started, though, their first trademark was just the word Nike, Nike. Any font, any color, all caps, no caps, doesn't matter. So they wanted to first get that word for the brand and get the company name known. And then after that, they wanted the logo. Well, they didn't just throw a swoosh out there, because if not, everyone would kind of be confused by this funky looking check mark. So they put Nike with a swoosh underneath it, and they built context with that mark and married those to the business. And then after, basically people knew the swoosh meant Nike, then they could drop the Nike and just have the swoosh and simplify their branding as they go forward. And then the next step was, hey, their catchphrase, just do it, right? Well, you never saw someone when that first came out walking down the street with a shirt that said, just do it, without the swoosh or at least Nike, because if not, it's out of context. You'd be wondering what the heck they're talking about. So you always kind of create that context. And then they go into the trade dress and the other things, like, Nike shoes are always in an orange box, right? So you're getting a Nike product as soon as you see anything related to it, so you don't make that mistake of buying a Converse shoe when you were looking for the Nike. So
yeah, no, absolutely. So you can see there's different tools for different things. Different businesses have more value in here. Some businesses have value over here, et cetera. But it's all different categories of intellectual property that we need to understand. Okay. So it's important to understand, as Scott has elaborated, that when we create intellectual property, if we go straight to monetization, hopefully you can understand now that your intellectual property would be at risk and could be stolen and all those kinds of things. Can you kind of walk us through that? Why is it so important to protect your intellectual property?
Well, because you're preparing for where you want to be, right? As a business, you want to prepare for where you want to be, and your internal things that are important. What's making you different? Your businesses, your creations, all the know-how. Basically, every one of you as an entrepreneur knows more right now than you did a year ago. Okay. And that process of elimination and those facts that you learned, that's competitive intelligence. That's competitive power that you've learned through your own trial and error, that if someone else got to cut in front of you and knew everything you knew right now without having to go through that fight that you guys have gotten to get here, then you're giving them kind of access to be in front of you competitively. So you need to understand that everything you're learning, that's building that competitive advantage that you didn't know before, that's part of your competitive advantage. And in a lot of those places, that's an opportunity to make sure that you have the internal procedures in place so that you don't lose that competitive advantage, and that a former employee takes your client list and goes and knows exactly how much you were paying for X, Y, and Z, and now they go compete against you. They take it down the street to whatever place, and now they say, hey, they're over there, they were going to charge you 4% for that. I can do it for 3.5%. And, I know exactly what you were getting over there. I have the whole client list and call everyone on the list. So those are kind of the things. That's one of the biggest areas. That's where you get the leakage of your intelligence, your competitive, strength as a business. We call that leakage, where people are taking stuff out. You're losing those advantages as quickly as you're gaining them. And that's an area that as a general counsel, you're always trying to protect, that your company doesn't lose ground at all because you're working so hard to gain it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are so many different things that people are really profiting off of, or that you've created that if someone were to take that and give it to your competitor, it would really harm your business. And so there's strategies to deploy to protect that stuff, right? So it's important that you understand these kind of concepts, though, as it relates to your intellectual property, because that's what we're working on, right? That's what we're building, okay? So some intellectual property basics. Let's go. I want you to take a look now at your asset list, okay? Take a look at the list and look at, now that you understand these a little bit more in terms of intellectual property, and maybe you already knew this, but some of you probably didn't, look at it and see how much of this is intellectual property now. How much of this is what we're talking about, right? And then you can take it the next step further. Before I monetize this, license it, all these various strategies, how would I protect this so that they can't just rip me off and steal it? You see what I'm saying? It's very important to understand that the things that we're creating that aren't physical products have to be protected very differently, right? It's another, guys, asset protection it's always about asset protection with California business formations. And now you guys are learning how to protect your intellectual property that is, in some of you, half or more than half of your assets. Some of you, it's almost all of your assets are intellectual, right? It depends on the nature of your business. If the things that you're creating that aren't physical, that are intellectual and aren't protected, it's like operating as a sole proprietor from a lawsuit standpoint. I have zero protection, right? I have zero protection. Somebody could take this and give it to my competitor or start their own business, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? Especially today's day and age with AI, software, con artists all over the place, right? What have you seen from these kinds of, these new ways that people can just attack your intellectual property?
Well, you see it in the areas you don't typically think of it. Typically, people think IP, they're almost always thinking, oh, that must be patents, and I don't make patents, I don't make new inventions, so it doesn't apply to me. Well, for most businesses, the patents aren't the big side. I mean, they can be huge. They're a huge advantage when you have them. Mm-hmm. But for most businesses, that's not the key part. It's the trademark. It's someone kind of stealing your web traffic because they think they're going to go see, Tiny Babble speech therapy, and they're going to an imposter that is Tiny Babbles in Murrieta or somewhere else, and they're using your good name that you've worked to develop, and they're diverting traffic. Or they're doing things like, from a copyright standpoint, for like our construction folks, they'll take the before-after pictures on a website and pull their after pictures and throw them in their portfolios if they did that work. That's a copyright violation. And then now someone has this kind of, they're stealing from you, right? That's work you've done. That's part of your portfolio. Those are really the easiest ones for people to do. And then, then the key is on the other part, on the trade secret, the kind of secret sauce hidden stuff. That is really usually general former employees or contractors or business partners or any of those where someone says, hey, you know what, I'm going to take what I learned here. And because California doesn't allow non-compete clauses very well. So you really can't write those into employee contracts. So how do you protect yourself as a business when you're trying to divulge information to people that you're trying to grow your business with? Well, you do it smartly. You have good contracts as the first line of defense, and then you have an IP, basically strategy that gives you a second bite at the apple. It creates that trade secret protection so that if someone were to take your stuff, they're both in violation on a contract basis and on an IP theft basis.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I mean, I can't imagine, I can, because unfortunately I've had to help people through this process where an employee has pilfered what they have and have given it to a competitor and caused immense damage, and it's almost always leads to a lawsuit. So, anyways, they're very specific things that we need to do. So like I said, before we monetize our intellectual property and we go to market with it, basically, we need to protect it, right? And there's as you can see, there's different kinds of strategies per the asset type, right? So we talked about them, the copyrights, the trademarks, the patents, it's trade secret protection strategies. There's a lot of different kinds of agreements that you can prepare, that you can enter into with business partners, independent contractors, employees, et cetera, and, like clauses in your service agreements, et cetera, very specific provisions that you can provide you can work these things into to protect your trade secrets in a lot of different ways, right? So there's very specific strategies for these kinds of things. The main purpose of this is so that you're aware that it's very, very different. And if we don't have this protected when we're looking to build all this passive income, it's like we're a sole proprietor and we're going into business with everybody else in our personal name, right? It's like that level of protection, which means no protection, right? It's that kind of thing. Okay, so asset protection is my goal here is for you all to understand that asset protection is much more than lawsuit prevention, much more than protecting our physical assets. It's also protecting our intangible as well. Okay, all right, great. And Scott, as I understand, there's some little bit of protections that California kind of you can do kind of California filings. It's not all federal, and there's some kind of basic corporate kind of protections as well. Can you walk through kind of the differences there?
Let's go through it. There are patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can protect those with a registration with the government, right? The United States Patent and Trademark Office is patents. That's the only body that does that. Trademarks has both local jurisdiction and federal registry. That's also the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And then copyrights also has some minor registry, especially for music and artistic creations. But then there's also mainly the Copyright Office. Okay. There's also what are known, from the local registration on the trademark, you can do a California trademark. And sometimes that works for a really localized business that you don't want someone to have, your Joe's Taco Shop of Murrieta. You don't want to see a Joe's Taco Shop in Temecula and you register because people will get confused as to which one's the real Joe's. Okay, so you register that with the state of California. That is the region that you're interested in, so you just get it. And it gives you a little bit of strength when it comes to, it really comes down to almost a muscled up common law enforcement, where trademarks and copyrights get what's called common law protection even before they're federally registered, because there's been protection for them since before there was systems in place to recognize it. So if you go back, 1,000 years, to like say Ming vases, right? It's like there was something wrong with someone trying to pass off a Ming vase as a Ming vase if it wasn't a Ming vase, right? And you would say, hey, look, I can see the trademark. You're trying to fool me into buying this vase when it's not theirs. And so even hundreds of years in other countries, they would say that's wrong. Same thing with copyright. If you're still in someone's artistry, that's the artistry. So say you take that beautiful Ming vase, and someone else says, hey, I'm selling Joe's vases, but I'm just copying the design of the Ming vase. That's a copyright violation. You stole his artistry and claimed it as your own. Again, that's a violation. So the courts, even all around the world, and even in the US, have always recognized that there's a certain amount of protection just naturally inherent, but you don't want to rely on it if you don't have to. So on the copyright side of things, typically if someone knows someone is violating their copyrights, you go ahead and you register the mark before you sue them. Because now you get to walk in with a form from the government. It takes about 3 months for it to go through the process. You get a form from the government that says you own that. So when it comes time to present evidence to the court, basically the other side now has to prove that the government got it wrong and said, and you are not the actual rightful owner. And that's a very tough burden on the other side, so your chance of winning goes up dramatically. On the trademark, you also get those options as well. But it's a little more nuanced than that. But when you get trademark registration, you do have a much bigger hammer to hit someone with. And so it's a lot better to have that full, if you can get a trademark registration, that's a wonderful asset, because that's also one of those things that stays with the company forever. And then it gets more, unlike the physical assets you buy, like the trucks and the other things, the IP theoretically it doesn't depreciate, it only appreciates. So it grows in value and helps with your exit, versus that line of trucks that you got, they're only going to go down in value. So this is where you can bolster. So a lot of times when someone does a valuation on the exit, the IP is the more important side than the actual equipment. Right. Because the equipment is, so you're going off of the goodwill and the knowledge and everything else that's going to be transferred over, that's going to help you hit the ground running and be profitable when you either buy another company. If you're looking to buy companies and expand, you need to look at it that way. Or if you're selling yours, you want to put it in the package as much as possible. I mean, an example of that is I was working with basically a snowboard goggle company, and they were being acquired by a company called Marchand, big, Gucci eyewear group. And, at that time, we'd only spent about $7,000 on design patents and provisionals. But when they came in to assess the value of the company, they spent 3 days with me reviewing, okay, what do they really have? How likely is this patent going to go and all that? And out of $7,000 that they had paid at the time, it changed their valuation multi-millions when the deal finally went through. So those are the kind of things that completely change that kind of mindset and that valuation as you move things forward. Just because they had the foresight to kind of put some things in place to kind of make sure they're where they wanted to go with the frameless snowboard goggle was going. So
yeah, a lot of business transactions or business sales that occur, the main thing that the person is wanting is the intangible property. I want your name. I'll take your phone number too, sure. So when people call your business, they call me, right? And I want the list. I want all the things that you've created, because I'll get a new staff. I don't really care about your beat up trucks, right? I want the intangible stuff. That's a lot of times what is the most valuable asset in these transactions. So that's why, now you're kind of understanding a little bit more about when someone says, I'm going to sell my business and the goodwill is valued at it. It's actually, they're basically evaluating the reputation of the company. Okay, yeah.
I was just going to add to that.
Yeah, go ahead. I
like to view that as kind of a system. Again, we'll go back to you make the best brisket in town, okay? The ingredient list is one part. And if you have a special spice blend, maybe there's some intellectual property there. Okay, so that's the ingredient list. Then there's a recipe, okay? There's a lot of intellectual property in the recipe, because how you make it is everything. So that's the recipe that gives someone the instructions. Well, they're still not going to make it as well as you, because they haven't gone through the process. Then there's the goodwill and the actual know-how that the chef knows that you take the slab of meat and you wait till it gets to room temperature for, a day. And you do all these other kind of things. That's that secret sauce. That's that hold back portion that you have, but you also need to know you have it so that it's protected. And then if you're going to go buy a company, you want to ensure that you're getting the hold back portion, because that's where a lot of times the best value. You say, hey, I just bought this company that has these great briskets. I got the recipe and it doesn't taste anything like the way I remembered. It's like, because you don't have everything that goes with that asset transaction. So you need to make sure, if you're buying, that you get it all. And if you are positioning yourself, you want to make sure that you know what each of those steps are. Where's my ingredient list? Where's my recipe? And now where's the training from the cook on how to make it the right way?
Yeah. No. And actually, I love that you just brought that up, because guys, if you didn't know, now is a great time to look at acquiring businesses. Okay, there are so many entrepreneurs that are retiring that are just folding it up, packaging it, putting it away. They're never going to sell their business, right? They don't know how. All the retirees, right? Guys, you could come in with almost no money down and acquire significant amount of even just the client list themselves, right? There's so much opportunity to do this, right? So, really take heed or take to heart this concept of valuation for the intellectual property, because that's really what you're going to be wanting when you acquire. Now, not always. Obviously, there's some businesses that have, substantial physical assets that you're going to want, but most of the time, most of the time, it's the intellectual property, right? I want your name. I want people know you. I'm going to acquire your company. You're going to work for me for a little bit, and then you're going to retire, and now I keep it, right? For example, right? A lot of transactions are structured that way, and there is a huge, I mean, the statistic, if you look it up, is shocking. On our next break, look up the statistic of how many businesses are retiring without being sold. Google knows, right? AI knows, right? Right? So just really take to heart, because you can grow your business substantially by acquisition. Acquiring new leads yourself is only one way to grow your business. You can acquire other businesses, scoop in their clients into yours, and now serve them, et cetera, and that would be a substantial way to grow your business. Okay, it's just one. There are many ways to grow your business. That is another way. There's mergers. There's all these other things. All these things can be done, and the opportunity right now is unlike our community here has probably ever seen in terms of the opportunity to acquire, right? So, so once we have this in place, guys, now you can leverage and monetize safely, right? Along with protecting yourself from insider attack, an employee taking your stuff and going to a competitor and that kind of thing, okay? Very, very important to understand this, especially if you deal, there are certain businesses that have intellectual property that can be leveraged and licensed. There's other businesses that rely on it for their very business, right? My secret sauce, right? That kind of stuff, right? So it's really important to understand what you have, and then we can protect it. So guys, if you would like more information on intellectual property, this is obviously a very complicated subject. Go ahead, get your phones out. You don't even have to download it. You just scan the QR code. It's a video, right? So take a look at that. I think it was over an hour. It's a webinar that me and Scott did on monetizing intellectual property and that kind of stuff. And you can learn a lot more about intellectual property, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets, patents, all that kind of stuff. So take a look at that, and then you can you can listen to it in the car or whatever, right? It's completely free. It's just like basically a link you can just watch. Okay. All right. Great. Guys, thank you, Scott, for being here. Appreciate your insight here. Scott will be in the back of the room for a couple of minutes. But obviously, we're happy to have you, lucky to have you here. Thank you for coming in here
Thank you.
and teaching us about intellectual property. All right, great.